Welcome to our sort of this month's webinar on harnessing artificial intelligence or AI in the workplace. Just by way of our introductions to begin with, so I'm Sam. I'm one of the solicitors here in the employment team, and I'm joined by Tom Hyatt. He's the senior solicitor in our employment team. By way of some background of housekeeping for those particularly who haven't perhaps attended one of our webinars before, if you can all just make sure you've kept yourself sort of on mute, just so we don't get that interference across. We always actively encourage engagement, however, so if you've got any questions as we go on through the webinar, pop them into the chat box, and what we'll do is pick them up either as we go, if it's a sort of appropriate points to do so, or alternatively at the end we've got sort of some time set aside for exactly that. Following on from the webinar, we will then be sort of sending out a copy of the slides as well as this recording, which on another note is being recorded. And likewise, if there's any questions we've not been able to get to, when we follow up with you, we can sort of come back to you on those specific questions as well if needed. So today we're looking at AI. And as a brief overview, we're going to be talking about sort of the uses of AI in the workplace, the legal framework, particular considerations around sort of data protection and processing of information, and then more practical steps as to what, as employers, you should be doing, as well as the risks involved when it comes to AI and the importance of an AI policy. So, as an introduction to all of that, what I thought I'd talk about in the first instance is the sort of core types of AI models which are sort of in existence in use, and they're sort of called either LLMs or RAGs. So LLM stands for a large language model, and this is probably the most common type, I would say, at the moment that most people are familiar with, i.e. it's like ChatGPT, which I'm sure, as I say, most people have probably come across, used, or heard of at the very least. And they're essentially learning models. They're creative. They recognize and generate text. So you can be asking them to create yourself a poem or an essay or whatever it is, and it's going to just effectively pull together what you've asked and come up with something. It will generate that. It can be a fantastic tool and really useful. At perhaps, getting that information, summarizing things, but it's never without risk. Because it is creating its own content, it is generating and pulling things together. There's a risk of what we call hallucination with large language models, and that's effectively where it can generate what would be considered plausible information. So the answer, you're going to look at it and think, oh yeah, that's right, that's what it's telling me, but it is in fact false. And we've seen examples of that in the legal industry, for example, where lawyers, and I hasten to add, this has not happened here at Harrington Carmichael, have relied upon it in order to sort of get case law and citations. And what's happened is actually ChatGPT has said, yeah, here's some cases showing what you're requesting me to look up, and it's just made them up effectively. It's hallucinated them, it's come up with them, and it's causes backlash at the end of the day. And the biggest example of this sort of in the legal industry at the moment is there was a claim being brought against the Qatar National Bank, and the claimant had inserted 45 different case law citations, and 18 of those turned out to be fictitious, as well as various other parts of their submissions. And that's came about because they were relying upon sort of generative AI to produce those. And this isn't a small claim. This was an £89 million sort of damages claim. So that just highlights part of that risk, and that's something between Tom and I'm sure we'll end up mentioning again, the sort of risks involved as we go through this. The other type of model, and one which I would probably, in my view, say is going to become more and more relevant to people and actually probably have more and more of a practical use, particularly in the workplace, is what we call the RAG, the Retrieval Augmented Generation. And what this does is it provides answers from retrieving data from a set knowledge base. So it's often will sit on top of a set database, and the users will be effectively input their query. The AI software is then going to retrieve that data and information to answer that query from the set database it has available to it, and then effectively generate a response. So there is an element of this sort of similar large language model, and that is going to generate a response at the end of it. But it is a more limited approach. But the reality of that is it's going to be less likely to have that risk of hallucination. It should be more factually accurate because it's based upon that set database. As I say, probably a more practical use. So it might sit perhaps on top of a company's CRM or similar sort of databases, and can be used to then be retrieving that data. That's pretty much my knowledge on these points of types. I'm not a tech expert or anything like that, but I thought it would be helpful, as I say, to go into this with an understanding of the course of models there. So then moving on to look at actual AI in the workplace. So when we're looking at AI in the workplace, I think there's two key elements to it. We've got the data side of things. So we're going to be talking about perhaps generational use of text, audio, images, etc. But also algorithms. So utilizing AI to do specific tasks, perhaps carrying out, tasks for us to perhaps simplify roles. And we've got here a list of sort of common uses of AI in the workplace. Now, this is looking at this from the perspective of yourselves as an organization, as an employer, but there's also going to be uses, obviously, employees are going to be doing, and I'll come back to those on another slide. But focusing first, as I say, on the common uses for employers, we've got things there such as recruitment and hiring, perhaps management, performance management, monitoring employees, and things like that. They can be summarized in different ways. That is not an exhaustive list, but we have some automation and efficiency. So this is more of a general approach. You might have AI in place to automate sort of common queries you might get from employees, or generate content for marketing purposes and things like that. Data-driven decision making. So that looks at elements perhaps to predict what needs to be decided, or optimizing your strategies. So in essence here, you're going to rely upon AI to analyze your data set and provide sort of responses and insights for you. From a training and development sort of perspective, AI systems might be used to identify training needs, and then generative AI may assist in even creating your training materials. You might be having it create slides for training, or perhaps sort of the information to go alongside it, or a plan, whatever that might look like. From a recruitment perspective, again, it could be used for screening or shortlisting. You might be inputting your set criteria, what your ideals are, into the AI sort of program or software, and relying upon it to go through and sift through the CVs or other data that's been inputted. So there's plenty of uses there in the workplace, and I mean, a lot of employees probably are using it at this stage to some extent. I think it's fair to say not everyone's currently adapting it. There's a lot here to potentially take on and utilize, and it's a developing space. More, I think, over as a year, the next couple of years, this is probably going to become more and more relevant to people. And that's why Tom and I are looking at this at the end of the day, because it's good to be having this in your mind as organizations start to adopt AI more. Then looking at the employee use of AI in the workspace. So employees, they even be using this without your knowledge. And again, it's why it's important to have for organizations to be getting a grip as to what the potential uses are, and having policies, procedures, etc. in place to monitor and sort of ensure there's sort of compliance to certain guidelines or standards. So common employee usage might be research. So they might be simply relying upon something like ChatGPT is their go-to source of information. In there, so obviously a lot of people otherwise be using Google and such like. In pre-Google, we had programs like Ask Jeeves, and what's come to light. So Google, I would say, is probably the most used sort of search function for most people. However, in some recent litigation that Google's been involved with, they've leaked the fact sort of strategy documents relating to ChatGPT, because they've formerly been involved in with ChatGPT, and they have effectively set out that the aim and objective of ChatGPT is to become the new Google, to take over, to be the go-to search function. And for a lot of individuals, that will be the case, because I think, from my view, would be it doesn't require people to sift through different sites and do that independent element of actually finding your answer. It gives you your answer, which ideally you then go away, validate, checks correct, and isn't a hallucination. But fact is, they are going to be using it for research. It could be using it for content creation, be that drafting, as we said earlier, sort of marketing materials. It simply could be preparing an email. They're going, they may well be using it. And as we said just now, marketing. So it might be producing, it can even produce images, or it could simply be sort of your posts people are putting on LinkedIn, whatever it may be. The reality is, most employees, if they're not already doing so, are likely to start using it. There are some really important considerations, though, and again, why some form of sort of policies and guidelines are likely to be important. So we also have to think about intellectual property. Now, there's currently ambiguity around copyright status. So if you've created something, let's say some training or marketing materials, it's currently ambiguous as to the eligibility of being able to copyright those materials. So there's obviously a bit of risk there. Ownership clauses. So depending on your AI software provider, they may have specific terms and conditions that dictate who owns the content which is produced by that AI software. And then there also could be potential infringement concerns. So where particularly the LLMs are drawing down on a vast source of data, i.e. effectively the internet, there's risk that they could violate IP rights if they're trained on third-party intellectual property use without authorization. So if they are going and pulling that data and information from certain sites, perhaps, and effectively rewriting or rewording content, there's risk there of violating IP rights, and it could be difficult to actually identify where it's got that information from. So that gives rise, all those concerns sort of come to our bottom point there of accountability. And again, this comes back to my initial sort of case study example there about hallucination. I think employees need to be verifying the sources of information and having that accountability. Without doing so, you run into that far greater risk of having potential hallucinations being included in text and content. So it sort of sits with employers to have those policies and procedures in place to ensure that that is then actually taking place. You'd then have potential recourse should employees choose not to follow those, which Tom's going to be talking more about the implementation and steps that employers can be taking moving forward when we get to slides that he's covering. We then have the current legal framework and compliance. So it's important to focus as to, well, what legislation's relevant here, what governs the sort of UK's position when it comes to sort of AI use. And the reality is there is not any specific central AI legislation or law, unlike in sort of the EU has adopted an AI legislation. We do not. We have not got an overarching AI law at the moment. What the UK government decided is, rather than creating anything like that, they are going to rely upon the existing regulatory bodies. So things like the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, the Competitions Marketing Authority, the Financial Conduct Authority, and such like. And then they're relying upon these regulatory bodies to oversee their respective sectors. There was a white paper back in March 2023, which had looked at this, and the UK government published a paper. It was titled "A Pro-Innovation Approach to AI Regulation." And where they decided it's going to be down to the regulators, what they did is set some standards and principles to guide the regulators. And these were the sort of principles were safety, security, and robustness, appropriate transparency and explainability, fairness, accountability and governance, and contestability and redress. And they've then handed effectively over to the regulators to deal with and implement this. The regulators are expected to interpret and apply those principles within their respective sectors. However, there is a centralized sort of department here, which has also been formed. So there's which coordinates the efforts and allows the various regulators to sort of point questions to. Outside of that, and then focusing less of a general AI perspective, more of a sort of employment law focus, what we need to the other legislation to be considering and framework to be considering is the Data Protection Act and the General Data Protection Regulations, as well as things like the Equality Act and Employment Rights Act, because whilst they don't specifically necessarily govern AI use, there's certainly crossover and sort of it's impacted by the AI use. So looking at what I mentioned just now, GDPR and data protection, the reason we can't sort of get away from this when dealing with AI and need to look at it is if employers are utilising AI for any sort of processes or anything like that, ultimately they're going to be processing personal data, and therefore it's going to attract the attention of UK GDPR, as it applies to all uses of personal data in the employment context, and therefore employers have the obligation to ensure that there is a lawful basis for processing employee data, and that there's also transparency when doing so. If we are using, for example, AI software to sift CVs, you're very clearly going to be processing that personal data, or perhaps if it was for the purpose of monitoring, which I'll talk about a bit more detail shortly, again, you're likely to be processing personal data. So we need to ensure that we are complying with sort of GDPR and the Data Protection Act when doing so. There is plenty of guidance out there and available as well, particularly from the ICO when doing so. And if there's any kind of automated decision making going on, so again, let's say it was hiring decisions related whereby it's fully automated by AI, it actually triggers. So it's Article 22 of UK GDPR, which effectively sets out that individuals have the right not to be subjected to solely automated decisions unless a certain conditions have been met. And again, the ICO provide a lot of guidance in that space. We can then look at what other sort of data-based and sort of issues are there and considerations needed. And one of these is respect for the individual's privacy, as well as fairness and transparency. As I mentioned, one sort of big use of AI in the workplace, and one of the common approaches we've seen at times is monitoring, particularly off the back of we're in a space where more and more employees tend to be remote working, at least partly. So some employees are implementing sort of policies, procedures, software to monitor, are they working? Now, in most cases, you'd hope it's not a necessity. You'd hope there's plenty of trust, etc. there. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, it is something that can be needed. And there's big crossover when it comes to monitoring employees and obviously their right to privacy. Back in August 2023, there was a survey conducted of just over 1,000 adults, and more than 70% of them said they'd find it intrusive if they were to be monitored by their employer in any way. Now, sort of monitoring I'd say we tend to think about here would be things such as perhaps key tracking, recording of calls, perhaps, or monitoring of numbers of calls and things like that. So we need to be careful. We're not effectively getting into a position, though, by relying upon AI, that we are resulting in there being a breach of those individuals' right to privacy. And likewise, there needs to be fairness and transparency around it. Again, particularly focused on monitoring. Employers really should be informing employees about any monitoring practices they have in place and the type of data being collected and the purpose for which they're doing that. The best place for documenting any of this is always going to be an employee privacy notice, because then it can be clearly set out for them. They know where that can be sort of located and detailed. We also need a lawful basis for processing any personal data for employees. So we need to establish what the lawful basis is. So why are we doing this? And in doing that, you should also be focusing as to what are the monitoring activities actually necessary and proportionate to your intended purpose, i.e., don't put everything in place all at once. It's likely to go too far. You need to think about, well, what is it we're trying to achieve here? So from we also can look at, sort of when thinking about data and ethical considerations, sort of there being security of the data. So if you're collecting, particularly through AI, a lot of data, you need to make sure you've got adequate measures in place to secure that data, and ensuring that it remains sort of secure with necessary cyber security measures in place. Employees will have a right to access any personal data that's being collected about them. So if you're monitoring them and collecting that data, but you need to ensure you've got mechanisms in place to then facilitate the employee's ability to actually access it should they request to do so, and likewise request any corrections or deletions if they think it's inaccurate. From a practical perspective, with all of that in mind, what steps do we think employees could be taking when it comes to monitoring and things? Now, again, ideally, employees don't need to be doing this unless it's strictly necessary. So when it comes to things like private messages, if you're monitoring all activity on a laptop, you may be going to a position where you're actually picking up on private messages and things like that. And arguably that may be too far. So limiting what sort of activity you carry out there. Considering alternative measures, so perhaps is there actually just some training that could take place, or just short-term monitoring activity rather than a blanket approach? Is making sure the monitoring activity being undertaken is perhaps sort of, again, appropriate? So perhaps if CCTV in the workplace might achieve the purpose needed, perhaps you don't need, again, other blanket measures for monitoring on the systems, because you've got what you need. And then one of the other ones could also be an impact assessment. So when you're considering to implement any specific monitoring activities, make sure you carry out that impact assessment, so you can look at actually, well, how is this going to impact the individual employees, and is that effectively going to be proportionate to the benefits achieved? I'm now going to hand over to Tom, who's going to be looking at wider aspects of AI from an employment perspective.
Great, thank you, Sam. Sam's obviously touched right at the start on some of the common uses. We all know how AI can help us. It can help employees with various things, but at the end of the day, we are employment lawyers, so we've got to unfortunately look at the risks associated and how we can mitigate them, how we can manage the risks that are associated with AI usage and the implementation of AI tools. First up there, look, the Equality Act. Nearly everyone on here will be familiar with what the Equality Act is. It protects people from discrimination based on protected characteristics. That includes age, gender, race, disability, among others. It should almost go without saying that any AI tools that are used within the workplace, whether that's being used by HR managers or being used by employees themselves, need to respect those rights. They need to respect the discrimination rights of other employees. It's not good enough for employers just to pass the blame on to the technology that they're using. It's never going to cut it in an employment tribunal if somebody is bringing a discrimination claim against you, to be able to say, well, it wasn't us, ChatGPT made the decision, it told us what to do, we were just following its advice. That's not going to cut it. employer here, companies, is still going to be on the hook and liable for any potential discrimination that's arising because of AI tools. Where do we see the potential for bias? I think it's quite broad. Fundamentally, as Sam mentioned right at the start, AI systems learn from past data, particularly large language models, which are trained on huge data sets. They're fed lots of information that they learn, and then they base their outputs on their understanding of the information that they've been trained on. So if that data set that AI tool is trained on is biased, it's inherently discriminatory, or there are underlying biases within that data, it's a very good chance that outcomes, any outputs, any text generated by that AI tool is going to have those same biases. And that can cause problems, particularly in recruitment, where common uses of AI tools could be CV screening, automated interview scoring, even language and phrasing, or even formatting of a CV could unintentionally bias the process against certain groups. And I will take you through a bit of an example to give a bit more flavour to this in a moment, because it is somewhere where there are issues. There are definitely issues when it comes to recruitment and the use of AI tools. Promotion and pay, and I suppose more broadly, a general performance management is somewhere where we see AI being used. Some companies, some employers will use AI to track performance, potentially to help decide who might be promoted, who might get a pay rise. And on the other end, if it's performance management, AI could be used to track somebody's performance, their output, and then ultimately make decisions on a performance improvement plan or something like that that's going to have an impact on that employee's role and potentially their future within the business. So there's a risk. There's always a risk of discrimination if the tool is not considering everything. There's an indirect discrimination risk, for example, if data wasn't accounting for disability, caregiving responsibilities. For example, here, if a AI tool was being used for absent management purposes, us as HR professionals, employment lawyers are going to know that we're not going to necessarily count absences that might be directly related to a disability, but unless the AI tool is trained on that, unless it knows, it might not do the same thing. So it's completely plausible that an absent management software might not discount disability-related absences in the same way that a human might, particularly if it's not completely clear why there might be an absence, whereas a human might work it out, add two and two together, and think actually we should be cautious here and consider this a disability-related absence. It's not a given that an AI tool would do that. So you can see how that could then generate risk of discrimination claims if we're not discounting those. Obviously, employers still need to make reasonable adjustments for employees with disabilities. Not all AI tools will have the nuances to know whether we're doing that or whether decision we are going to make is going to impact on a disabled employee's right to have reasonable adjustments. Accountability and liability. So it almost goes without saying, but if discrimination happens because of AI, employers are still on the hook. Even if it is a paid for premium AI system from a third party, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to shift liability. Certainly the default in an employment tribunal setting is going to be that the employer is liable. There is not going to be a defence to an employment claim for discrimination that we were using the tool. It doesn't matter if it was an expensive tool or that it's promised that it was bias free and it was trained on diverse data sets. It is still going to be the company that's liable for any potential claims, discrimination claims, or for that matter, any employment related claim. To give you a bit of an example here, there are a couple of cases and scenarios that I'll talk you through. One a little bit more recently and one an older one, but I like to bring it up just because it's fairly interesting. The first one is a little bit more recent. This was only last year that we got this claim cropped up. It's a claim of Manjang and Uber Eats. Mr. Manjang was an Uber driver. He was black. He was suspended by the app. So the app that he would log into before starting a day of work with Uber Eats, he was suspended from the app after there were repeated failures of Uber's own AI facial recognition system, which he had to use to verify his identity in order to be able to start taking work and picking up jobs and ultimately earn his income. So he brought a tribunal claim for race discrimination. He argued that the facial recognition system was less accurate for black and non-white drivers, which placed them at a disadvantage. Now, the evidence in this claim was actually quite clear that there was a strong case. There was quite a measurable difference in accuracy of the AI recognition system. So it was putting black and non-white drivers at quite a significant disadvantage because they were repeatedly failing the AI facial recognition system. And in his case, Mr. Manjang's case, he was banned from the app. There were enough times that it had failed the facial recognition that he was banned. To make things worse, in this case, there was not any clear information provided to the claimant here about the reason. There was no fair challenge to the rejection. There was no challenge to the suspension of his employment. Now, this case was actually settled. It was settled just before a final hearing, so we don't have a judgment on this case. But what did it do? It drew a lot of attention. It drew attention to how automated decision making could create an incredibly unfair outcome, especially where people's livelihoods are involved. And in this case, a tool which was biased or had not been developed sufficiently was creating a detriment. It was treating people of particular races detrimentally compared to others. So it doesn't take a genius to work out that there was a discrimination issue here. What should have happened? What should Uber have done? Well, certainly there should have been more checks in place. Their systems should have been tested an awful lot more than they were. They should have been audited for bias. They should have known before rolling this system out that there were potential biases in the application of their facial recognition system. Had they done that on before implementing the system, then it could have been avoided. They could have avoided a claim. They could have avoided treating people badly because of their race. And in any event, it's one of those cases where even having a human review process would have mitigated this somewhat, particularly if it allowed the claimant in this case or any other Uber Eats workers to be able to challenge the automated process. But in their case, they had an automated decision. They were locked into the AI automated decision with no chance to appeal. So there's never a human insight. So I think, although we don't have a judgment here, it's probably fairly obvious which way the claim would have gone, and that's likely reflective in the fact that it did settle before a hearing. Another example that I like to talk through. Now, this is a bit of an older one. It was back in 2015, and this involves Amazon. Now, Amazon started to develop an AI-powered recruitment tool to help with recruitment, to help with automating screening of CVs and job applicants. Now, if we think back to earlier when we were talking through AI tools and how they're developed, so this system was trained on data, as all large language models typically are. It was trained on Amazon's own data. It was actually trained on the last 10 years worth of hiring data, mainly for their tech roles, Amazon inherently being a retail and tech industry. So now, and even more so 10, 20 years ago, it was a fairly male-dominated field, the technology roles within Amazon. And previously there had been a trend of them hiring predominantly men into those tech roles. So as a result of having learnt based on previous hiring data, the AI tool looking at which CVs previously had been successful, when it was reviewing the new set of CVs, when it was put into place and they were testing it, it started to downgrade CVs that the AI tool had worked out were female CVs. Now, I think that they had redacted names so that the AI tool wasn't going to be inferring any type of biases from names. But what they hadn't thought about, probably naively, is that the CVs were picking up on language. It was picking up on the inclusion of the words woman. So, for example, women's football team captain, or a all women's college in the US. So it was picking up phrases and terminology within CVs like that, and then downgrading those CVs and ranking them lower. It's also found that it was favouring male CVs where language was perceived to be more likely that this is a male CV. So in this case, obviously nobody set out, Amazon did not set out to create a tool that would penalize female job applicants and candidates. But inherently, by training it on the data, which had done that in the past, that's exactly what this tool was doing. Luckily, for Amazon's case, they scrapped the tool before it was even implemented. This was back in 2018, so a few years ago, which is a lifetime ago in the world of tech and AI. I think that they took the view that this was just more trouble than it is worth. We cannot get this all working and operating in the way that's actually helpful. So in their case, differently to the Uber case, they scrapped it before it was ever implemented. So it was never deployed in live hiring. But still, it's a case that really highlights how historical discrimination and historical biases can be amplified and continued through the use of AI, particularly where AI is trained on non-diverse data sets. And I think it still sounds and provides some good learning points for employers nowadays. Fundamentally, that if data is trained on past decisions and those past decisions include biases, it's very likely that those will be replicated. Importantly, too, which I think this case highlights, is that the value of auditing AI tools, auditing algorithms for discriminatory patterns, and if training on your own data, making sure that it is diverse. Because in Amazon's case here, unlike Uber, they're at least able to avoid litigation. They were able to avoid rolling out a tool that was inherently discriminatory. And again, it comes back to having the human oversight. Without that human oversight, you're increasing the risk enormously. It's essential whenever you're using AI in hiring and key HR decisions that there is a human oversight. You cannot rely on AI solely to be making decisions that need to be fair and obviously non-discriminatory. So a couple of examples there. I think it's good just to add some real world examples of why it's important to get it right, why it's important not to just launch into AI tools without too much thought, and then have to pick up the pieces later on where you've accidentally, in most cases, created a tool that's going to cause you a lot of problems and not be fair and unbiased in its decision making. We'll move on to the next slide. I think is useful just to talk through some of the practical steps. We've spoken a lot on AI tools, what they do, what the risks are, but how do we actually look about doing this safely? If we're going to introduce AI tools, if we're happy with employees using AI, as Sam mentioned, there may be employees within a business that we don't even know if they're using AI tools. So that's, again, something we just want to cover off in the practical steps here. Now, arguably, and I think the very first thing that we would tend to recommend is a risk assessment, auditing. So reviewing how and where AI is currently being used across your business. So this might include HR, customer interactions, content creation or internal processes. It's important to know what's already in place, where AI tools are being used and by who before introducing anything new. It's important to identify any potential risks, like we touched on a moment ago, such as bias, data misuse, potential intellectual property issues. In some cases, it might even be necessary or recommended to try and scale back or even stop AI tools where these risks might outweigh the benefits, certainly before you may have had a chance to implement some of the next practical steps, such as training and policies being developed. Review. What do we mean by this? We mean looking at which tools we might want to use, which AI tools might improve workflow efficiency, what might automate routine tasks or reduce costs. And fundamentally, only where there's a key and clear business case to do that. We probably don't want to be implementing tools that may come with risks if there's no value in doing that. So we'd always suggest, look, deciding whether these tools are actually appropriate. Are they appropriate for the particular team, environment, a role? Not every role or context is going to be suited to AI support, so it should be tailored and adopted accordingly. Having thought in regard to, is it appropriate to be using this tool for this particular task? The next one, workforce integrations. So I think it's key to decide whether staff are going to be allowed to use AI tools, whether you are happy with the likes of ChatGPT being used, considering what roles, for what tasks you as HR professionals might be happy with, or line managers might be happy with for their employees to be using. That might be drafting, brainstorming, customer support. Will obviously be different for every business and potentially different roles. And if yes, if we decide yes, there is a clear business case, we are happy, we want employees to be using these tools, then at that point consider developing and starting to look at a policy that outlines exactly what is allowed, what the boundaries are, and what the expectations are for responsible AI use, rather than just a general here it is. Training, assessment and planning. What do we mean by this? Well, establishing clear guidelines. We want to define exactly how ChatGPT or other AI models, similar tools, could be used. So we want to know exactly what we're happy for it to be used with, as I mentioned, when we're looking at integrating it. So it might be writing content, summarizing information, idea generation. If it's something that we're not sure, then we might need approval channels. It may be a particular task that would require approval from a line manager, from HR, if needed. You want to outline what not to use AI for as well. There will be particular tasks, particularly involving confidential data, legal decisions, anything that could carry a reputational risk. It's unlikely to be a task that we're going to want to allow employees or ourselves as HR to be using AI for. I think training is a key one. It's sensible to have rollout training, particularly where we are openly allowing employees to use AI tools. It's sensible to maybe host an introductory workshop, a tutorial, get staff familiar with what generative AI is, and importantly, where its limitations lie. And that will probably look like something not too dissimilar to the type of content that Sam and I covered earlier around looking at the risks and biases and explaining that to employees that might be using AI, so that you can get buy-in and an understanding as to why this isn't something suitable for absolutely every task across the business. A part of that training as well is going to come with regular updates and refresher courses, a bit of a self-explanatory one, but there's no point having a policy or having training that's just sat there on the shelf, not updated. Because as Sam mentioned right at the start, this is a fast-moving area. There are changes left, right, and centre. 3 years ago, most people wouldn't have even heard of ChatGPT, and now I think everyone's heard of it. So this is not a situation when you're looking at implementing AI or you're allowing employees to use it, you can just have training from the get-go and not update it, not refresh it, and keep it current. Encouraging responsible use and dependency, and this ties in quite nicely with the policy and the training. It's key really to emphasize that AI is here as a support tool. It's not a replacement for human thinking. When you're delivering training, it's key to underline the fact that staff should always be using their own judgment and professional standards for any task. And whilst you can use AI to potentially make your job easier, potentially with first drafts, etc., at the end of the day, employees should always be using their own judgment and professional standards. when they are creating content or fundamentally carrying out their role. Lastly, developing a policy, and this is something that we find ourselves talking to more and more employers about. And I'm going to skip to the next slide where we've got a little bit more information on this. One of the things to do early on, something that we tend to recommend, is putting in place an AI policy. What do we want this to cover? Permitted, restricted AI uses, and I think this is key to an AI policy. We want it to be clear what AI tools are allowed or which AI tools are off limits. It's helpful then to give clarity to the employees and ultimately helps avoid misuse of tools that we really don't want employees using or for tasks that we don't want them using it for. So think about which tools are going to be approved and in the context of whether or context of what they should or shouldn't be used for. It's going to be different for all businesses as well, and different for all different roles across the business. So there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to this is what a policy should say you can use an AI tool for, and this is what you can't, because it's going to be completely different and it will need to be tailored for your business. A nice tip that we tend to recommend is encourage the use of company email addresses. It's a good idea to require staff to use a work email address when they are accessing AI tools, particularly if it is browser-based. So ChatGPT being a key example there. It just helps keeps the usage of that tool tied to the company. It makes it easier to manage permissions, and it does help improve accountability. If there is a tool that's only being used for work and somebody's not signed up with a personal email address, it also gives you the ability to be able to look. And it's not about spying on employees and investigating what they're doing, but it's to give some accountability so that you know that you can enforce your policy ultimately. Guidelines is key. You'll want to be clear about what not to do. So things like not sharing commercially sensitive data, customer data, any personal data, really, particularly into the likes of ChatGPT or open source AI tools. I think also stressing that if you're prompting AI tools, then they shouldn't be offensive, inappropriate, biased. IP, cybersecurity, ethical considerations. This is what Sam touched on earlier. It's definitely worth reminding employees within a policy about the legal and ethical sides of AI. That would include not using AI, for example, to misuse third-party content, considering other parties' IP rights, keeping data secure, making sure that tools are used in a way that aligns fundamentally with the company's values and responsibilities. Probably a fairly consistent theme in this webinar is that fundamentally, no matter how clever the AI tool is, in most cases, it's going to need a human check, and that's where the review processes comes in. Most AI-generated content should go through a review process to catch anything that is biased, inaccurate, or just off-brand with what the business expects. The reasons for this will be obvious, and it's what we discussed around the risks of AI use is bias, but also reputational damage if there's content being produced, like marketing content, for example. Monitoring of usage, may want to reserve the right to monitor content, and this is where it's helpful if you've got employees using a work email address to the extent that account might be needed. And again, it's not necessarily about surveillance, but making sure that any outputs still align with what the company expects in terms of standards. Training, and I mentioned this before as a practical tip, but I just think it's an important one to underline. Before you are openly getting employees to start using generative AI, we would recommend some basic training, including how the tools work, common risks, and how they're used and responsibility. I think that includes training on the AI policy itself too. There's very little point in having a policy that nobody understands, nobody's given any training on. So if you're going to take the time and be proactive and put in place an AI policy to protect yourselves as well as employees, then it makes some sense to carry out some training on that as well. And lastly, and I'm conscious of time and want to be able to answer any questions, so I'll be brief, but consequences of breaches, fairly self-explanatory. As with any policy, there needs to be clear consequences. If somebody misuses an AI tool, breaches the policy, then you want to be clear within your AI policy that could lead to disciplinary action, and in serious cases, possibly termination. So you want any AI policy to tie in neatly with your disciplinary policy as well, so that it does have bite. It is has got some substance. Like I said, something we are talking to more and more employers about as we see more and more usage of AI. If you've got any questions, you're looking to implement an AI policy, or you need any help with that, don't hesitate to reach out to Samurai. We are very happy to have a quick call and talk you through it. That's the last slide from me. Sam, I don't know if you've been looking at the chat box. I'm hoping there are some questions. If not, now's the time. Please fire any questions. We'll be here for a few more minutes, so please ask any questions that you want to.
So yeah, there is a couple of questions just coming through at the moment. I'm just pulling them open to have a look, because they've literally just arrived. So we've got one question here looking at the copyright and intellectual property point. Looking at that, effectively, if you've relied upon AI, so ChatGPT, for example, to write a policy that an organisation is then using and publishing on websites, what are the considerations there? And I mean, from my perspective, I think, yes, there's risk if it's drawn down on sources, for example, online using other people's content, which is copyrighted. I think the nature of the policy or document you're having it prepare will often weigh into this. You're not a policy is unlikely, I think, in its own right to be copyrighted anyway. So therefore, if you're asking it to prepare a policy that you're then using, I think it's low risk that there'll be a copyright issue. If you're sort of putting out perhaps more sort of marketing material or something like that, and it's pulling it from elsewhere, that's where there could be a greater risk. I also think a function you can sometimes use on things like ChatGPT it is almost reverse engineering. So once it's provided you with something, you can kind of question it as to, well, what are the sources here? So you can also, and I can't say always, I think, 100% accurate in being able to provide that information, but often it is, and you should, I think, sometimes be able to almost check against where it's come from. Any views from yourself on that, Tom?
No, I think you're right. I think it's a pretty low risk issue in the chance of a policy. Is it likely to be somebody else's IP? Are you going to be infringing somebody else's IP because you've got a policy that's been generated by the likes of ChatGPT? I think it's pretty low risk because it's not content in the sense of, as you say, marketing content. Do you need to flag that it's made by AI? I'd say no. I think it's incredibly low risk. I have seen the old policy that says something like, this policy was drafted with support of AI tools. Is it necessary in this context? Probably not. But I think it still comes back to the point of checking it over, and it's unlikely that it's going to be fit for purpose straight off of ChatGPT anyway. So it's probably going to look slightly different by the time that it does get into a form that's publishable anyway. I hope that helps. Obviously, in an employment law perspective, if you're drafting a policy that's going to apply to employees, then I think even more key to go through that human review process to kind of address any biases or any second thoughts about how a policy applies. But no, I don't think anything further on that one.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, just a couple of others. One questioning I'd mentioned, obviously, that whilst we don't have legislation in place, the EU does and has implemented it, and where they can get information on that. The best place that I would probably point you towards on that. So the legislation itself is literally called EU AI Act. It's a very creative title there. There is, on the European Parliament website, there's sort of a topic sort of section with almost an article which has a really good sort of summary about the implementation of that, the timescales for sort of compliance and implementation, and what it's designed to cover. So it's about that's where I would point you for that. And Tom, the last sort of question currently here is then looking at effectively just querying how we use it as a firm and ourselves, and exploring how we use it.
but certainly not to generate case citations like the barristers that came unstuck, as you mentioned at the start. No, I think, well, look, I think everyone's pretty upfront in that ChatGPT and the likes are really useful tools, and they can be useful for probably not so much research. I don't know. I think you'll find a lot of roles that are using almost on an informal basis. A lot of organisations, probably ourselves included, I think it's easy to see companies taking on board AI tools and for all sorts of recruitment and performance management. In our experience, the reality is that's not as widespread as some people would like to have you think. But I think it's naive to think that general large language models aren't being used. Yeah, probably a fair summary.
Yeah. Well, look, that's the current questions. So I'm assuming, unless if we sort of end the event in a moment and suddenly you think I didn't get a chance to type a question, we're going to be following up on email over the next sort of couple of days with a copy of the slides and just sort of a link to the recording. So obviously, if you've got any further questions to Tom or myself, you can always then, when we follow up, sort of drop us a line. But otherwise, thank you for those of you that have attended and stuck with us through that, and yeah, we'll be in touch.